Everyone remembers Ayrton Senna. Everyone remembers Roland Ratzenberger. But what if I told you that just weeks later, Formula One nearly lost another driver in a horrifying accident that barely gets mentioned today? No TV cameras, no sold-out crowd, just a private test session at Silverstone in 1994. And yet what happened there was every bit as terrifying as Imola. A car flying, debris scattering, a driver's legs shattered, and a survival cell flung like a toy. This was the day Pedro Lami's life nearly ended, and the day Formula One quietly looked away. 1994 is etched into Formula One's memory as the year of black armbands, funerals, and reform. Imola's weekend claimed Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna, and it shook the sport to its core. But while the world focused on those losses, another event unfolded just weeks later at Silverstone that exposed how fragile Formula One still was. Portuguese driver Pedro Lamy, young and promising, was testing after emergency regulation changes meant to make cars safer in the wake of Imola. But in reality, nobody truly knew what these new setups would do at speed. And on that test day at Silverstone, everything went wrong. His car spun violently, lifted off, and slammed with such force that it ended up in a pedestrian tunnel beyond the barriers. The survival cell, the one part of the car that's supposed to stay intact, was literally thrown down the track. Lamy's injuries were brutal. Both legs broken, unconscious. His career nearly ended before it had begun. Marshals and team members scrambled to put out the fire, while he was airlifted to hospital. But unlike Senna and Ratzenberger, Lamy lived. And because of that, his tragedy became the one Formula One would rather you forget. Now let's break down why this crash mattered so much, and why it's still one of the most shocking, hidden moments in F1 history. Pedro Lamy wasn't a household name yet, but he was the kind of raw talent that made people pay attention. Born in Portugal, he had stormed through junior categories with his aggressive style and fearlessness. By 1993, he was in Formula One with Lotus, and many saw him as one of the drivers who could lead the next generation. But 1994 was a cursed season for young drivers. The cars were unstable, the new regulations were rushed, and no one fully understood how the changes would affect aerodynamics. Teams were experimenting on the fly, often using test sessions to gamble with setups that hadn't been proven safe. That made testing just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than race weekends. Lamy stepped into this storm with determination, but the environment was stacked against him. The death of Senna had already pushed the FIA into panic mode. The changes made were meant to slow the cars, but in reality, they created unpredictable handling characteristics. Lamy, like so many others, was left as the guinea pig, and on that day at Silverstone, the experiment. During the Silverstone test, Lamy lost control at high speed. His car spun violently, then lifted into the air, a terrifying reminder of how unstable the aerodynamics had become. In seconds, the Lotus turned from a machine into a missile. It smashed into the barriers, tore through them, and ended up in a pedestrian tunnel area behind the track. The crash wasn't just violent, it was catastrophic. The rear of the car caught fire. Debris was scattered everywhere. The survival cell, the strongest part of the car, was hurled down the track like it was made of plastic. Imagine watching from the pit wall and seeing the one piece of the car designed to protect the driver literally ripped out and flung across the circuit. It shattered the illusion that F1 had control over its own technology. This was supposed to be a safe test environment, but it was anything but. Marshals were caught off guard. There was no massive live audience, no rolling TV cameras to show the world. But those who were there said the scene was chillingly similar to Imola. Smoke, wreckage, silence, and the terrifying uncertainty of whether the driver inside was still alive. When Pedro Lamy's Lotus finally came to rest at Silverstone, the scene looked like something out of a war zone. The car was mangled almost beyond recognition, its rear end ablaze, its debris scattered across the track and into the pedestrian tunnel behind the barriers. The survival cell, which was supposed to be the strongest, most protective part of the car, had been thrown down the track like a discarded toy. For anyone watching from trackside, the first thought was grimly simple. No one could have survived that. Inside the wreckage, Pedro was unconscious. His body had been torn by the violent impact, his legs shattered with multiple fractures. Both femurs, the thickest bones in the human body, were broken. These weren't minor injuries that a driver could grit his teeth and overcome. These were life-threatening wounds that could have left him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. To add to the terror, the rear of the car was on fire, and there was a genuine risk that the flames could spread to where Lamy was trapped. Marshals and Lotus team members rushed to the scene. Unlike the chaos that Roger Williamson faced 2 decades earlier, here at least there was urgency. They scrambled with extinguishers to battle the fire, desperately trying to keep it from consuming the wreck. Every second mattered, and the air was thick with panic. Medical crews arrived and stabilized Pedro as best they could. His helmet, tilted sideways from the impact, gave rescuers the chilling impression that he might not even be alive. But then came the faintest signs of life. He was breathing, barely, though he remained unconscious. With his broken legs and head trauma, moving him was dangerous, but there was no choice. The fear wasn't just about whether he would race again, it was about whether he would survive the day. He was pulled from the wreck, placed on a stretcher, and airlifted to hospital by helicopter. The whole process was frantic, desperate, and fragile. At the hospital, surgeons worked to piece him back together. Metal rods, screws, and plates were inserted into his shattered legs. For weeks, the question wasn't whether he'd race again, but whether he'd even walk again. This was Pedro Lamy's fight for life, one that would define not only his career, but also his legacy. Survival was miraculous, but it came at a cost. His body was scarred, his career trajectory derailed, and his accident largely erased from Formula One's public narrative because he didn't die. And here lies the heart of the controversy. Why don't people remember this accident? Why isn't Pedro Lamy's Silverstone crash etched into F1 history the same way Senna and Ratzenberger's deaths are? The answer exposes the cold, selective memory of Formula One. First, this wasn't a race weekend. There were no TV cameras capturing the crash live, no worldwide broadcast transmitting images of a driver fighting for his life. It was a test session, private, low profile, and largely unseen by the global audience. And in Formula One, if the cameras aren't rolling, the story simply doesn't get the same weight. For the sport's executives and promoters, tragedy without spectacle is easier to ignore. Second, Pedro survived. And survival, in the brutal logic of F1 at the time, meant the story didn't matter as much. When a driver dies, the sport is forced into soul-searching and public mourning. Senna's death at Imola triggered outrage, political intervention, and sweeping safety reforms because the world saw it happen live. Lamy's accident, while equally catastrophic in terms of violence and cause, was quietly brushed aside because he lived to tell the tale. The FIA didn't have to answer hard questions. There were no funerals, no global headlines, no collective grief to manage. Third, timing buried the story. 1994 was already the darkest season in decades. Imola had scarred the sport just weeks earlier. The deaths of Senna and Ratzenberger dominated the narrative, alongside Karl Wendlinger's coma-inducing crash at Monaco. By the time Lamy's accident happened, fans and media were emotionally exhausted. The Silverstone crash became just another incident in a year defined by tragedy. The world focused on Imola, while Silverstone slipped into obscurity. But here's the truth that makes this so damning. Lamy's crash was a warning shot. It highlighted the same issues that killed Senna and Ratzenberger: unstable aerodynamics, rushed regulation changes, poor preparation, and inadequate barriers. The difference wasn't that Formula One had learned its lesson. The difference was luck. Pedro lived, and because of that, his accident became one more example of F1 sweeping its failures under the rug. Pedro Lamy's story is one of resilience, survival, and tragedy hidden in plain sight. His Silverstone crash should have been remembered as one of the great turning points in Formula One safety, a moment when the sport came within inches of losing another young star. Instead, it became a forgotten footnote in the cursed year of 1994. After months in hospital, endless rehabilitation, and surgeries that rebuilt his legs with metal plates and screws, Lamy somehow clawed his way back. By 1995, he was back in Formula One with Minardi, scoring a point at the Australian Grand Prix. That single point was symbolic, a defiant statement that his career wasn't over, that he had beaten the odds. Later, he transitioned to endurance racing, where he carved out a long, successful career in sports cars. His story should have been celebrated as one of the most remarkable comebacks in motorsport. But the reality is, the legacy of his crash belongs less to his comeback and more to what Formula One failed to do with it. Unlike Senna's death, Lamy's accident didn't spark reforms. Unlike Ratzenberger's loss, it didn't force officials to look at circuit safety with fresh urgency. Because it happened in testing, Formula One treated it as if it didn't matter. The FIA got lucky. Lucky that Pedro survived, lucky that the world wasn't watching, lucky that the outrage never came. And because of that luck, the Silverstone crash was buried. Yet, if you look closer, the message is clear. Formula One in 1994 wasn't just dangerous, it was reckless. Drivers weren't just competing with each other, they were gambling with death every time they stepped into the car. Lamy's survival shouldn't make the crash less important. It should make it more important because it shows how razor-thin the line between life and death was that season. Today, when fans talk about 1994, they talk about Imola. But the forgotten truth is that Silverstone could have easily been another funeral. Pedro Lamy's survival was miraculous, but it was also the sport's escape route. A tragedy they didn't have to explain. A disaster they could quietly ignore. That's why this story is the horrifying tragedy Formula One wants you to forget.